Hi there, I'm Mark Caicero, and this is the Highlighter Article Club, where we read, annotate, and discuss one great article every month on race, education, or culture. This month, we're diving into Looking for Clarence Thomas by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Mitchell S. Jackson. It was published in Esquire back in August, and when I read it, I knew immediately that I had to reach out to Mr. Jackson to see if he would say yes to doing Article Club. I have to admit, I was a little nervous to contact him because if you don't know, he won the Pulitzer Prize for 12 Minutes and a Life, his profile of Ahmaud Arbery. But then I listened to some of his other interviews, like the one he did for Longform, and he seemed like a good guy, so I went for it and emailed him. And the generous guy that he is, he said yes. Article Clubber Sarai and I got the chance to speak with Mr. Jackson a week or so ago, and I have to say it was one of my favorite interviews over the last 3 years. I hope you enjoy it. Here it is. Thank you, Mr. Jackson, so much for doing Article Club.
Thank you for having me.
Sarai and I are here to ask you tons of questions. I'll just show you. We've marked up the text of Looking for Clarence Thomas, so we're ready. Really excited to just ask you some questions. But first, we're also huge fans of your last huge piece about Ahmaud Arbery. And we just wanted to ask you right at the beginning, how did it feel when you learned that you had won the Pulitzer Prize?
Oh, it was surreal. The way that it happened well, I guess it wasn't last summer, or was it? Maybe it was. The National Magazine Awards had been postponed, so it was the night before the Pulitzer announcement. And so I attended virtually the National Magazine Awards, and there was, it's an in-person thing, so you don't know if you're going to win. And they announced the winner for feature writing at the end of the show. So now I got to sit through a whole award show. And then there was the jubilation of winning. And I was excited. I didn't really know how excited to be until a guy who worked at Hearst emailed me right after, and he was like, "Mitch, this is our version of the Oscar." And I was like, "Oh man, like that's so cool." Yeah. So then the next day were the Pulitzers, I was like, there's no chance of, you winning. So I was like, I'm just going to take a nap. And right before I lay my head down, right before I could get into a good sleep, I got a call from my friend Tyemba Jess, who went to graduate school with me, but also more importantly, won a Pulitzer, I think in maybe 2017 for poetry. And Jess was like, "Man, congratulations." And I was like, "Congratulations on what?" I'm like, he could have been talking about the National Magazine Award. And he was like, "Man, you won a Pulitzer." I was like, "Get out of here, man." So yeah, it was very exciting. And also it was surreal in that I didn't know if I actually won because they do it on Twitter. So I mean, they could have made a mistake. Like, I'm not on Twitter. So it didn't really hit me for probably a day or so.
Yeah, it's amazing. And like when we read the piece, it was just at that highest level. I put out 4 articles a week, and this was like your piece was like the best one of the entire year. I like to say that I predicted the Pulitzer for you, but just wanted to, because I was first, I didn't tell you about that. But okay. Yeah. And then when I read this piece, I was like, okay, he's at that same level. And so Sarai's got the first big question just about like how you started the piece. So go ahead, Sarai.
Yeah, I like to ask everyone we talk to about how their pieces are technically written and some of the kind of choices that they make and the ways they kind of pull readers in or kind of just like put readers in a certain like context right from the beginning of the piece. And I believe that the way that you have the Gullah language and the translations like right off the top, it centers the importance of like where all of this is coming from, especially considering the denouncing of that language and of that space that happens later with Clarence Thomas. So I love to ask, like, what are you thinking when that's beginning, that first part of your piece? Like, what is at the forefront when you're making those choices?
So I should back up a little bit and say the Clarence Thomas piece was not even my idea to write. It was my editor, Ryan D'Agostino at Hearst, he was also one of the editors on the Ahmaud Arbery piece. He's like, "Man, Mitch, I got a story for you." And I was like, "Well, what is it?" He was like, "Man, Clarence Thomas." And I was
no,
like, nah, yeah. I'm like, what? Hell no. So then he was like, "Yeah, we can team write this thing." And I'm like, team write? Like, I've never team wrote anything. Like, how are we going to do that? And so he's like, "Oh man, we'll figure it out along the way." So we actually did research for this piece together. So a lot of those trips that I took, like when I was in Pinpoint, he was there. He was the white guy going up asking people, "Can we interview you?" But during that time, when we went to Pinpoint, we met the guy that ends up telling us the story of Thomas's birth. And between that and going to visit the old cannery or fishery where there was a woman guide there who spoke Gullah, and it was the first time that I had heard it. And I was like, how hard can it be? Like, I speak, Ebonics, like I'm sure I can catch it. And she said a sentence to me and I said, oh, I don't know what you just said. And so I actually had visited her first. And then when I went to where Thomas was born, actually, I didn't know it. I was going to his friend's house. And then his friend pointed and said, yeah, he was born right over there. And it was like 100 yards away. And as soon as he said it, I said, oh, I'm going to do this guy's birth in Gullah. So in the beginning, I thought I was going to be able to learn Gullah, be able to write it myself. And then I resisted the piece so long. Like I actually wrote this piece in like 7 days. That by the time I actually sat down to write it, and the opening was the first, I knew there was no way I was going to be able to do the Gullah. So luckily, Ryan found the guy who translated it for me. But instantly, when I heard a woman speaking it, I mean, I had already read about Thomas and his relationship to it. But when I heard someone speak it, and then I was literally standing a few feet from where he was born, I said, oh, I'm going to do the story of this guy's birth.
Wow. It seems that like another aspect of that is like it really, because when you have translations of something, you're like, okay, these are the two languages that are important. You're gonna miss something if you don't have this translation. And the people who would need a Gullah translation because English is inaccessible, that is not often some things that we think about. So the ways that it kind of trickles down, no Republican pun intended, like the way that Thomas's individual attention to people versus a group attention to people like is offset kind of by the way that your translation appears in the beginning. And I feel like your word choices throughout the piece, like the vocabulary, like the ways that you choose to write, it really shifts the ways that people are allowed to understand writing and allowed to read and access like, critical thought. So I find that combined with the translations in the beginning really add a layer of complexity to the piece. I'm just wondering like a little bit more about that. What are you thinking when you're making those choices in your writing?
So I do want to clarify. I did write it in 7, but it wasn't, I mean, this was editing too, right? So I wrote that opening and I had to send it off because obviously I couldn't translate it myself. And I should also say that the way that and I forget his name now, I should know this, the way that he translated it, he actually sent it back with my words and then his words. And I had in the opening, in the beginning, I was thinking of having it side by side, but when I read his in the way that he had sent it back to us, I was like, oh, this works. In terms of the language though, I'll say that's all. If you read anything that Alfonso Brown sent that translation back in that way. And I thought to me, I wasn't missing anything. And it was something to seeing it kind of stacked up on each other. The language, I'm always trying to kind of undercut this highfalutin academic intellectuosity and to do it with language. And I also felt like, as a Supreme Court justice, there's so much gravitas given to that position, so much esteem that I wanted to bring Clarence Thomas down to a human, which is also why I use the Gullah. The Gullah is one thing, but it's also the story of his birth. Like, no, this guy was just a little nappy head boy running around barefoot in the woods at one point, right? So all of that is really coming out of the same place. It's like, I want to bring him down to the level of the rest of us. And if the language can help me do that, then, but the risk is also that you humanize him. Like I remember sending the opening to someone and they were like, don't make me like this guy. And I was like, don't worry, I'm gonna tell the truth, but you got to tell the whole truth. And the whole truth was that he was this young person, who had these aspirations. And I'm like also thinking to myself, what would it have been like to only speak Gullah? Right? Because if we had a conversation, like if I came from Oregon and met this dude when he was 5 years old, I would not have known what he was saying. Right. So I also had to be aware of that. But yeah, I do think the language is key. And I'm really always trying to push against what everyone says is convention.
Yeah, one piece that I noticed about the language is also the directness right to the reader right after you introduce his childhood. So I don't think that I was worried that you were going to have some sort of compassionate sort of characterization of Clarence Thomas, but then you made sure to like just let me know how you felt. And also you use his words sort of against him right from the beginning. You say, he says, you hate yourself for being part of a group that's gotten the hell kicked out of them. And then you call that the Rosetta Stone. Can you say a little bit more about the Rosetta Stone piece?
Yeah, I mean, I just thought, you at a certain point, I was having a conversation, and I should also mention a guy named Mark Warren, who was a previous editor at Esquire, now at Random House, who just worked with me and Ryan on this. When it was going to be a team written piece, he was going to be the editor for it. And then at a certain point, Ryan said, "Oh, I'm a white guy. I can't write this piece," which is a part of the reason why it turned into 7 days, because I thought I was going to be doing a different kind of thing. But yeah, the Rosetta Stone, I think, is really, I mean, we had a conversation. It was like, well, what are we trying to ask about? Like, what are we? And I was like, man, we're looking for Clarence, man. We're trying to find out, like, who the hell is the real Clarence? And so that reading that line, which I think comes from his memoir, to me felt very crucial in understanding him, right? I know a lot of Black people, and I don't know a lot of Black people who express that sentiment. And I think that is really, I mean, if you look at the way that he has publicly spoken about Black people, if you look at a lot of his jurisprudence, I mean, if you look at his personal life choices, like that felt like he was telling on himself in, a perfect an encapsulation of how to read him.
That makes me, because I was in my head a couple times. I was like, I'm going to get on here and I'm going to make an ass of myself because I'm going to say something that makes people think that I'm okay with Clarence Thomas. Because like you do present a picture, of him like, fuck this guy. Like the multiple fucks, by the way, was really comforting in this piece. Like the different ways that you just slid those in there, super comforting as a reader. Because when something's written for you, right? And if there's no way that you respond with something like that while you're reading, like you're kind of aware that wasn't written for you. But I digress. Because at the end of the piece, and Mark has more on this, I think, a little bit, but you do present a humanizing picture of him, and you do present, okay, this is a Black man, this is a person who has sold us out in multiple ways, but he still has a beginning, he still has an origin story kind of thing. And to me, like, this is really representative of the ways that there's a spectrum of ways that people deal with white violence and white rage, and the ways that white people, attack. And Clarence Thomas has chosen a piece of the spectrum where he is wanting, like you say in the piece, like he's wanting to prove that he's okay by their standards. He's wanting to denounce his own people in ways that will make him aligned with, good enough. Like definitely want to bring James Baldwin, your quote by James Baldwin, into this about that limbo aspect. But I want to know more about like what you're thinking about this piece, like what he's responding to. Like, how do you go from being this person in South Carolina to being Clarence Thomas? Like, did you find him? Like, were you able to find him in writing this piece? Like, what do you think? Because I agree, like, I did not want to read about Clarence Thomas's life. I was like, I do not care. Like, what points are you making? But you do make some very clear points about what you think. And I'm just wondering, like, did you find Clarence?
Yeah. Well, I think early on, I was talking to a friend about this piece, and he said, well, everybody knows Clarence Thomas is a sellout. And I was like, yeah. So then if that's ground zero, then where do you go from there, right? Like, I don't think there's any dispute among reasonable people that Clarence Thomas is, by almost definition, a sellout. And so, but I can't just write a whole 6,000 words saying Clarence Thomas is a sellout. And so then I was really trying to get into, in interviewing people, most of the people who would actually talk to me were people who were his friends, who had very kind things to say. And they were, talking to me about his kindness and how he would stay after at assemblies and talk to kids and, do all these kind things. And I was like, well, there has to be a seed of humanity in there. And so what is that humanity? And then how is that still present? But then how is he also able to do these really dramatically malevolent things to wide swaths of Americans. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't have any answers outside of, I think pinpoint was really crucial. And I don't know if it really came through in the way that pinpoint allows him to like keep a hold of his roots, but also he's like, it's like a hagiography. Like he's a hero when he goes home, right? Everywhere you go, it's a sign that says Clarence Thomas was here. He used to use this library. I mean, when you go to Pinpoint, it's like, welcome to Pinpoint, hometown of Clarence Thomas, So I think to be able to go, like whatever he does out in DC, and he's also built a world in DC, right? Which is disconnected from the real world. Like he's in the far right, right? Like he's not even a Republican. Like he's in a whole other universe. And so to be in that universe and to tell yourself, well, I'm a Black man, I actually think that I'm doing right by people, and to go home and still be a hero, like I feel like that is crucial to the way that he is able to persist and endure, because everything else is such a deep contradiction, right? He is such a deep contradiction, and I don't know how you can maintain those paradoxes without getting some kind of positive feedback.
Well, I mean, one part is that the limbo part. So like, yeah, so you weren't going to write 6,000 words on something that everybody already knows about. But I felt like one of the big contributions was, oh, by the way, I'm just going to bring in James Baldwin here in the middle, rather like you, I want to hear about like how you came upon that quote, because I hadn't necessarily seen that one, but also where you placed it. And then it just felt like it really opened up this idea that he's isolated, as powerful as he is, he might be isolated, or it's like, so how did you get to that limbo part and James Baldwin?
I was thinking about that limbo early on because I'm an educator as well, and I've taught that essay. I mean, I used to teach it every semester, probably for 10 years. If Black English isn't a language, then tell me what is the title of the essay. And so in my head early on, I was like, oh yeah. Well, actually, no. I would say that it kind of crystallized in thinking about him being at those kind of far right conferences with his wife, and knowing that those people are people who hate him, right? Like you out here clapping for Jenny, and these are the same people running in the Capitol and ties to white supremacy, right? So I'm like, those aren't your people, right? And then I'm like, well, every time you talk to a Black person and he says like, if you ask him, I think he would say that he's down for Black people, right? But I don't know a Black person who would cape for Clarence Thomas. So if the people who you are with are not your people, and the people who you claim are your people, like, man, you in a bad spot. Like, I can't imagine you could get a group of 1,000 people who were actually his tribe together. And that must be a really sad existence for someone who, at so many turns in his life, has looked for that acknowledgement, right? And that community.
I definitely was like, fuck Clarence Thomas. Like, I don't care. Like, like, I was like, I don't care. Because Mark and I were discussing this loneliness and this like humanity. And in my brain, I'm like, I don't care. Like,
me, at the end of the day,
who cares?
Sob story. So what?
But him then using the Black card with the Anita Hill with the lynching situation, the whatever part, and then the way you place the description of what an actual lynching was. Like that dissonance, the dissonance that is created in his mind, I cannot even imagine. Right. But then for him to turn around and use this, what you call, or what is in the essay, a race card, after he has taken every single opportunity to disregard the group's call for justice. Like, what does that kind of dissonance do to a person? And also, like, what were your choices in including this description of this lynching, this woman being hung upside down with her baby? And for example, like what happened with Ahmaud Arbery, like the discussions of what were your decisions there? Like, how were you, because we could have used several examples to describe why that wasn't a lynching, my man, and why you sound ridiculous. But like, what was going on there?
Well, one, I absolutely had Ahmaud and what I had said about that in that story. And, thinking about the NAACP's definition, I didn't want to repeat that, but I also wanted to really point to lynchings that happened in his area. So I wanted it, so it wouldn't be just disconnected, right? Like those are all things that happen in his area. And I wanted to point to things that were like, because every lynching is important, right? The lives of all of those people are important, but there are certain ones which are so heinous and either reported or underreported, right? So so there were, over the course of this thing, this was like 6 months worth of research, begrudging, that gets down to, it's a Tuesday and they're like, man, we need copy by Saturday, right? So, but there were a lot of conversations along the way, lots of interviews and conversations, and certain things would happen. So when I was in Pinpoint, I said, oh, I'm going to do this opening in Gullah. I knew that from very early on, before I said any words down on this thing. Along the way, when I was reading about Anita Hill, I said, oh, I am going to do a list of lynching. Like, I knew that going in. So there were certain things, like when I was thinking about Baldwin and that quote, like I knew that quote was going to be there. So there were just markers along the way of things that I knew I wanted to include. And then it was just kind of seeing it built out and then recognizing where those pieces could fit. And the last thing was, the one trip that I took that was by myself was to DC. And that was like maybe 10 days before the story was due. And I did it because I had been talking, we had already decided that we were looking for Clarence Thomas, and that was going to be the title. I was like, I can't look for Clarence Thomas and not go to DC. Like, well, the Supreme Court is closed. I'm like, yeah, but that's almost the point too. So I was very, very thankful that I pushed to go in those last few days to DC. I mean, it was really enlightening to see where he lived, to see how placid that subdivision was, to see the I don't know, U.S. Marshals out front, to go to the court and see the long, tall fence. Like, to me, that was all very much a part of this. And also to engage with those protesters and that solemn young Black woman. That was, I think that was all really necessary. And it was something that was a writerly choice that I made alone. Like, I'm gonna just get on this plane and I'm gonna go to DC. I don't really have a plan, but I'm gonna get in this rental car and I'm gonna go to this dude's house. Yeah.
Yes, I must say the piece about interacting with this Black woman that was there, and the fact that Clarence Thomas used this Black card against a Black woman who was accusing him. I don't have a question. I just need to like add another tally to the reasons why like I don't fuck with him. But like, yes.
The irony of that being across the street from where those hearings took place it was lost on me in the moment. Like, I didn't know that we were standing across from that building, but when I went back and researched, I was like, oh, we were literally 100 feet from where the hearings actually took place. So to me, that gave it that much more emphasis.
Yeah, you talk about like the writerly choices, not just to go to Washington, but also the language and what you're trying to do with language. Sarai and I were talking before about, it's like all of the decisions that you make, the details, but also the structure and the organization. We read a ton of these articles, the highest quality articles. And what we were talking about earlier, wanted to ask you about, is that it just seems that not only are you at the highest level, but you're doing something new. And especially in sort of like white dominated publications, you are now offering something that's not just the highest quality, but it's changing, I feel, what long form, I was using the word canonically. And just wanted you to sort of speak to that as far as like, I mean, obviously you're trying to also get the copy in.
Yeah. They wanted it.
and we want to know like out of all of this, your entire endeavor that you're on, you know, like how much of it are you, I guess, how aware are you of your readers and like what we are getting out of your writing?
It's a lot. We're getting a lot out of it.
I think the thing that is different, I wouldn't call myself a journalist. One, you know, I come out of fiction writing. I have an MFA, 2 MFAs really in fiction. And so I came to this with that set of skills. And in my mind, the other thing about my fiction is I'm very much concerned with the sentence. I'm almost concerned with the sentence over the story. And so the benefit of writing nonfiction is that you don't have to invent the scenes, but the the kind of ethos of wanting to make beautiful sentences is like that's really what I want to do. And I also think if you're gonna write a feature, there should be some break from convention. And it's easier for me because I don't know all the conventions, but there's one thing that I'm trying to do. Like there's the gala there's the long list at the end of Mari, and what you should know about mod. I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine last summer, and there's a list of names, and they're actually my childhood friends, and so I'll give the name and then what do they some characteristics about them. And I'm actually writing another piece for them right now and trying to imagine like what is the thing that is going to break this out of convention, because I actually don't want to do it if it's just a straight. Some people were like, oh, you could just write a straight ahead feature. No, I'm not interested in that. Like I'm interested in trying to push myself, and if in pushing myself the form goes somewhere, that's great. But yeah, I think a journalist comes in going, what's the story, right? And what's the information? And I come in thinking like, what art can I make of this? And what music can I make of this? And then this, you have to still do the reporting work, but I think those are like two different like paradigms actually, right? So I don't have a journalist paradigm. Like I'm not trying to get to the big story, like I actually like doing stories of the smaller people rather than, this is one of my aversions to writing about Clarence Thomas. I'm like, man, I don't want to see no more Clarence Thomas pieces or Jenny. Right. So, yeah, I do. I'm thankful that people can see that I'm trying to push myself in form and in language, because that's always the goal. That's the goal before anything else.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Jackson, Mitchell, Mitch. We could keep on asking you questions, but also just Sarai, any last questions for our author here?
Similarly, I could go on for days, but I feel really good about what we talked about. Mm-hmm. But yes, in terms of the way you're talking about pushing your form and or not necessarily looking to push the form, but rather pushing yourself in ways, I think that's really awesome. There's like a lot of, especially being in education, like there's a lot of emphasis to pay attention so that you can break the rules. And like hearing you say like, you're not even sure of the rules and you're out here winning Pulitzers, like who knows, you know what I'm saying? Like it's really refreshing. Like I was saying, the language, the shifts, like all the ways that you're inviting and also setting the tone and setting the stage and also wrapping it up for us, like in the timeline, like really giving the kind of, this is empirical evidence. Like what I'm saying is what I'm saying, this is it. Like, and having really, you can tell you're standing on your voice in this piece. And that's really, 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 really refreshing and much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just want to thank you so much again. I mean, obviously we're into reading. We're not, like we're educators. I'm not a writer. Sarai's a writer. But most of the folks in Article Club are just folks who like to read the top stuff. And so just to be able to speak with you today and for you to be so generous, we just really want to thank you so much.
Thanks, man. Had a good time, man. Thank you all for reading it. I hope it keeps finding its way to an audience.
One more time, I'd like to thank Mitchell S. Jackson for coming onto Article Club and for sharing your process and your craft with us. You truly are doing something new in the long-form nonfiction genre, and we at Article Club are very grateful for that. Article Clubbers, we're going to be discussing Looking for Clarence Thomas on Sunday, October 23rd from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Time. And if you're interested, you can find out more information and sign up at highlighter.cc/discussion. Also, feel free to email me at mark@highlighter.cc with any questions that you have. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.